Welcome. In the great theater of American politics, moments of genuine, unscripted truth are exceedingly rare. We are often served a carefully curated performance, a play of talking points and rehearsed attacks. But every so often, the mask slips, the script is thrown away, and in that raw, unfiltered space, something real and consequential happens. What you are about to read is the anatomy of one such moment. It took place in the heart of the Phoenix Convention Center, at a forum ostensibly about leadership and unity. But it became a crucible, a flashpoint where two visions of power collided. One was the power of position, of title, and of sharp-witted dominance. The other was a quieter, more patient power, rooted in restraint and a profound understanding of human dignity. This is the story of a single sentence, a 10-second silence that felt like an eternity, and a response that would echo far beyond the walls of that room, sparking a national conversation about the very soul of leadership itself. What you are about to witness is a political lightning strike. Millions watched it unfold live, a moment of spontaneous combustion in the sterile, air-conditioned expanse of the Phoenix Convention Center. The event, a bipartisan forum on leadership and unity, had been a model of choreographed civility. Then, Vice President Kamala Harris leaned into her microphone. The polished, professional veneer she had maintained throughout the discussion sharpened, her eyes fixing on Senator John Kennedy with a new intensity. The words she spoke were not part of any prepared remarks, they were a blade, unsheathed and aimed with deliberate precision. "Sit down, boy." The room gasped as one. It was not a murmur, but a sharp, collective intake of breath, a sound so sudden and unified it seemed to pull the oxygen from the hall. A profound silence followed, heavy and tangible, like the dead calm before a lightning strike. Thousands of people, activists, students, local business leaders, pastors, and a gallery of national reporters, sat frozen, their eyes darting between the two figures on the stage. A woman in a blue blazer near the front clutched her notebook, her knuckles whitening. Behind her, a young man in a baseball cap whispered to no one in particular. Did she just say that? His phone already rising, its lens aimed at the stage. The cameras of CNN, Fox News, and every other major outlet did not blink. Lenses zoomed, capturing the scene in stark close-up, sensing a moment that would ripple far beyond the desert heat of Phoenix. Harris leaned back in her chair, her expression a mask of unreadable composure, while pockets of the crowd stirred with nervous energy. Some murmured, unsure if this was a moment to applaud or to recoil. Others exchanged glances of pure disbelief. A pastor from Tucson in the third row slowly shook his head, his lips pressed into a thin, tight line of profound disappointment. The air, once filled with the polite hum of civic discourse, now crackled with a dangerous, divisive tension. And then there was Kennedy. He did not flinch. He did not slam his hand on the table. He did not rise to his feet or fire back with venom. Instead, in a gesture of almost maddening calm, he adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses with a steady hand, leaned back slightly in his chair, and let the silence stretch. That small, deliberate non-action carried more weight than any shout ever could. It was a declaration of control, a refusal to be provoked, a quiet assertion that he would respond on his own terms, in his own time. The audience, sensing this, leaned forward as one, a vast, silent entity holding its collective breath. Whispers rippled through the rows. "Is he going to say something?" a college student muttered to her friend. In the press gallery, reporters held their fingers poised over their keyboards, their professional instinct to narrate the moment clashing with their human instinct not to miss what was about to happen. The moderator, Professor Elaine Carter from Arizona State University, shifted uncomfortably, her eyes flicking between the vice president and the senator like a spectator at a high-stakes tennis match. The cameras tightened their focus. On one screen, the faint tightening of Harris' jaw, a flicker of confident expectation in her eyes as she waited for the reaction she had clearly intended to provoke. On another, Kennedy's folded hands, resting calmly on the table, his posture serene, his gaze steady. He did not take the bait. He simply held the space, allowing her words to hang in the air, their sharpness beginning to curdle into something awkward and ugly in the prolonged quiet. It was the kind of silence that makes your pulse quicken, your throat dry, A man in a suit near the stage whispered to his colleague. "This is going to be everywhere tonight." His colleague just nodded, his eyes glued to Kennedy. Sensing the quiet was not tilting in her favor, that her intended power play was backfiring, Harris leaned forward again. "What, nothing to say?" she asked, her tone a sharp, taunting prod. A few nervous laughs broke out from a corner of the room. But they died quickly, swallowed by the suffocating weight of the moment. Kennedy's lips curved into a faint, measured smile. It was not a smile of mirth, but of resolve. He tilted his head slightly, finally meeting Harris' gaze with a look that contained no anger, but something deeper, and far more formidable. The crowd stirred again, a low murmur spreading like wildfire. Everyone knew something was coming. For nearly 10 full seconds, Kennedy let the silence hold the room hostage. It was a masterclass in restraint, each second stretching the tension until it felt as if the air itself might snap. Harris, visibly impatient, leaned into her microphone a third time. "Come on, Senator, don't just sit there," she pressed, her voice now carrying a distinct note of irritation. Finally, Kennedy moved. He leaned forward, just slightly, his hands still folded, and looked directly at the Vice President. The room held its breath. "Madam Vice President," he began, his voice low and steady, that unmistakable Louisiana drawl carrying both warmth and weight through the microphone. "I've been called a lot of things in my time, but I've never needed to raise my voice to earn respect." The room erupted. It was not applause, it was a detonation of sound, a thunderclap of approval that rolled through the hall. Hands clapped until they stung. People rose to their feet. The pastor in the front row lifted his hands and shouted, "That's right." Harris' face tightened, her eyes narrowing, but she was rendered silent, a spectator at her own political unraveling. Kennedy did not let the noise overtake the moment. He raised a hand gently, a quiet gesture of command, and the crowd, eager to hear more, began to quiet. "Respect," he continued, his voice clear and unhurried, "isn't something you demand with a title. It's something you build with your actions, with how you treat people, especially when they don't agree with you." The applause surged again, louder this time, a great, crashing wave of sound that filled every corner of the hall. A young woman in a red jacket stood on her chair, clapping fiercely, shouting, "Say it again." The moderator's attempt to restore order was a whisper lost in a hurricane. The room was no longer hers. It belonged to Kennedy. He sat back, his hands still folded, letting his words settle. Harris shifted in her seat, her expression a frantic calculation as she searched for a way to regain control. But Kennedy was not finished. He turned his gaze from her to the audience, his eyes scanning the rows, making a connection with the thousands of people who were now hanging on his every word. "We're here to talk about leadership," he said, his voice rising just enough to carry over the murmurs. "Leadership isn't about telling someone to sit down. It's about inviting them to stand up with you, to work together, to find common ground, even when it's hard." The room roared, a mix of cheers and stomping feet that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. A group of students near the back began chanting, stand up." The phrase, born from his words, was already becoming a rallying cry. The moment was no longer just a moment. It was a collision of ideas, of values, of two competing visions for what leadership could mean. And as the crowd continued to clap, as the phones recorded, as the reporters typed furiously, it was clear that this was not a story that would stay in Phoenix. It was already spilling out into the world, a spark that was about to ignite a national fire. The Phoenix Convention Center was no longer a forum, it was a crucible, alive with the raw energy of a moment that had transcended its agenda. The echoes of applause from Senator John Kennedy's measured response still hung in the air, a testament to the chord he had struck. The moderator, Professor Elaine Carter, made another attempt to steer the conversation back to the structured safety of her questions. "Let's move to the next topic," she said, her voice firm but strained, like someone trying to corral a stampede with a polite suggestion. But the room wasn't ready to move on. The moment was too alive, too charged. Kennedy leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed but purposeful, letting the crowd's energy settle without rushing to fill the silence. That choice alone spoke volumes. A woman in the front row, A community organizer from Flagstaff whispered to her neighbor. He's not even raising his voice. But he's got the whole room. Her neighbor just nodded, scribbling furiously in her notebook. Vice President Kamala Harris, meanwhile, sat rigid, her fingers tapping a staccato beat against the desk. Her earlier confidence had been fractured by the crowd's overwhelming response to Kennedy. She was a skilled debater, accustomed to controlling the rhythm of an exchange. But the rhythm was no longer hers to command. "Senator," she said, leaning into her microphone, her voice sharp but now lacking its earlier certainty. "If you've got something to say, say it. We're here to talk leadership, not play games." The words were meant to be a jab, an attempt to pull Kennedy back into a conventional verbal sparring match. But they landed flat. Kennedy simply set his glass down, the soft clink amplified in the relative hush, and looked at her with a calm that seemed to completely disarm her. "Madam Vice President," he said, his Louisiana drawl steady and warm, "I'm not here to play games. I'm here to talk about what leadership really means." He leaned forward then, just enough to draw every eye in the room, his voice low but clear. "Leadership," he said, "isn't about who can talk the loudest or cut the deepest. It's about listening, really, truly listening to the people you serve. It's about showing up for them, not just for yourself." The room erupted again, applause crashing like waves. A group of teachers in the fifth row stood, clapping fiercely. Harris' face tightened, but she did not interrupt. Kennedy's words were no longer just a response to her, they were a direct challenge to a style of politics she represented. He turned his gaze back to the audience, his eyes sweeping across the sea of faces. "We are here because we believe America can be better," he said, "but better doesn't come from tearing each other down. It comes from building each other up, from finding what unites us, even when we disagree." The applause surged, now joined by the rhythmic stomping of feet that reverberated through the hall. A woman in a bright yellow scarf stood and shouted, "Preach, Senator," triggering a new wave of cheers. The cameras panned across the faces in the crowd, young activists, their eyes wide with inspiration, an older businessman in a suit, nodding slowly as if rediscovering a forgotten truth, a teenage girl clutching her phone, recording every word. CNN zoomed in on a black pastor in the front row, his hands raised in quiet affirmation, while Fox News framed Kennedy's steady posture, his calm commanding the screen. Harris tried to regain her footing, to pivot the conversation back to her own terms. She leaned into her microphone, her voice cutting through the fading applause. "Senator, with all due respect, leadership is about action, not just words. People want results, not speeches." It was a solid, classic political counter, but Kennedy didn't miss a beat. He turned to her, his expression steady, almost kind. "You're right, Madam Vice President," he said, his voice unwavering, instantly validating her point before masterfully turning it to his advantage. "Leadership is about action, but the first action is always respect. Respect for the people you serve, respect for the truth, and respect for the idea that we are all in this together." The crowd roared, a tidal wave of sound that drowned out any chance of a quick reply. A young man in the third row stood, clapping so hard his hands turned red, shouting, "That's leadership." The chant spread through pockets of the audience, their voices rising and falling like a heartbeat. Kennedy raised a hand, not to quiet the crowd, but to acknowledge them. His gesture was simple but powerful. The noise softened, not because he demanded it, but because they wanted to hear what came next. "Folks," he continued, his voice carrying a warmth that felt like a conversation, not a lecture, "I've learned something over the years. You don't lead by making people feel small. You lead by making them feel heard. You don't win by shutting someone down. You win by lifting them up." The room exploded again. The applause was so loud it seemed to shake the walls. A group of young women near the stage started chanting, "Lift them up, lift them up," their voices blending into a rhythm that pulsed through the crowd. A man in a denim jacket leaned over to his wife and whispered, "He's making sense, isn't he?" She just nodded, her eyes fixed on the stage. The moderator, Professor Carter, seemed to give up on controlling the room, her hands resting on the table as she simply watched Kennedy command the stage. The senator leaned back again, his hands still folded, his eyes scanning the crowd. "I've seen a lot in my time," he said, his voice softening, becoming almost reflective. "I've seen folks divided, angry, ready to give up on each other. But I've also seen what happens when we choose to listen. When we choose respect over resentment. When we choose to build instead of break." The room quieted again, hanging on his words, the energy shifting from a frenzy to a focused intensity. A nurse from Scottsdale wiped a tear from her cheek. Kennedy's voice rose slightly, just enough to carry over the murmurs. "Leadership isn't about who's got the sharpest jab. It's about who's willing to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard, even when it costs you something." The applause came again, softer this time, more thoughtful. As it began to fade, Kennedy leaned forward one last time. "We're here to talk about unity," he said, his voice steady. "But unity doesn't mean we all have to agree. It means we have to respect each other enough to listen, to learn, and to move forward together." The room erupted a final time. The applause resolute, as if the crowd had found a mission. A group of activists near the stage held up signs they had quickly made on the back of their programs. "Respect unites." Harris sat silently, her expression unreadable. The moderator, sensing a final chance, stepped in. "Thank you, Senator," she said, her voice steadier now. "Let's take a question from the audience." But the crowd wasn't ready to let go. They clapped and cheered, and Kennedy sat back, letting their energy carry the moment. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't thrown a punch. But he had shown what leadership could look like when it was rooted in restraint and respect. And as the cameras rolled, as the reporters typed furiously, as the forum finally drew to a close, it was clear this wasn't just a moment that would be remembered. It was the start of something bigger. A story that was already escaping the walls of the Phoenix Convention Center and beginning its journey across a nation that was desperate to hear it. The Phoenix Convention Center had become a lightning rod, but the storm it unleashed could not be contained within its walls. As the forum concluded, the crowd poured onto the Phoenix streets, not with the weary shuffle of a finished conference, but with the buzzing, electric energy of a movement just born. Camera lights from news vans pierced the twilight. Satellite trucks hummed with activity, and reporters scrambled to capture the raw reactions from attendees still grappling with what they had just witnessed. The story, however, was no longer bound to that hall. It was already surging across the nation through screens, airwaves, and the instantaneous, chaotic channels of social media. Senator John Kennedy's words had ignited something, and the country, weary of division and starved for a different kind of leadership, was ready to listen. Under a temporary spotlight, a CNN correspondent spoke with sharp urgency into her camera. "Tonight, we didn't just see a political debate," she reported. "We saw a masterclass in leadership." Senator Kennedy didn't just respond to a challenge. He redefined the very terms of what it means to lead with respect in a fractured age. Across the street, a Fox News host offered a different, yet complimentary, angle. Kennedy spoke for millions of folks who are tired of being talked down to by the coastal elites. He said, his tone firm. He didn't take the bait. He stood his ground with dignity. That's why this moment is resonating so powerfully. Both networks, and every outlet in between, replayed the clip relentlessly. Harris' sharp command, Kennedy's measured 10-second pause, and his calm, devastatingly simple words landing like stones in still water. The moment was being analyzed, dissected, and packaged for a nation that was just beginning to grapple with its meaning. On social media, the explosion was even more immediate. #Stand with Kennedy soared to the top of the trending list. Neck and neck with #Respect Unites. A shaky video, filmed from a phone in the audience, capturing the raw, thunderous roar of the crowd after Kennedy's line about lifting people up, hit 3 million views on TikTok before the night was over. Another professionally shot clip, posted by a national news outlet, showing a tight close-up of Kennedy's steady gaze, was captioned, "Leadership isn't loud. It's clear." It racked up 200,000 retweets before dawn. But the conversation wasn't just online, it was intensely human. In living rooms and diners across the country, people paused to watch the clip on the evening news. In a Pittsburgh diner, a group of factory workers on their dinner break gathered around a flickering television. Their burgers untouched. "He didn't even flinch," one of them said, his voice low with a kind of grudging respect. That's how you handle a jab. A waitress refilling coffee nearby nodded in agreement. My daughter just sent that to me on her phone. She said, she told me, that's how you stand up to a bully without having to be one yourself. In a Miami high school classroom the next morning, a history teacher played the clip for her students. She paused it after Kennedy's line about listening to the people you serve. What does this teach us about leadership? She asked. A boy in the back row, usually quiet and disengaged, raised his hand. It means you don't have to yell to win, he said. Sensing the moment's gravity, Kennedy stepped into the swarm of reporters waiting for him outside the convention center. Microphones and cameras crowded his face, but he didn't shy away. He adjusted his glasses and spoke with the same steady Louisiana drawl that had commanded the stage. Folks, he said, addressing the chaotic scrum as if it were a calm conversation. This wasn't about me or the vice president. It was about what we value as a country. Respect, listening, the hard work of finding common ground. A reporter from the Phoenix Times pressed forward. Senator, do you believe the vice president's words were inappropriate? Are you demanding an apology? Kennedy's eyes twinkled with a hint of a smile. I don't need to label what she said, and I certainly don't need any apologies. I just think we're all better when we try to build bridges instead of walls. The clip of his response outside the hall went viral in its own right. Shared with captions like, class act, and, this is what taking the high road looks like. Not everyone was cheering. Supporters of the vice president pushed back online, attempting to frame her words as a bold and necessary assertion of authority. A tweet from a prominent California organizer read, VP Harris was speaking from a position of power and refusing to be condescended to. Kennedy's response was just sanctimonious posturing, but the tide of public opinion was overwhelmingly in favor of Kennedy's restraint. In Houston, a pastor named Reverend Ellis wove the moment into his Sunday sermon. Respect isn't about who's got the bigger chair on the stage, he preached, his voice booming through the church. It's about who's got the bigger heart to listen. A clip of the sermon, posted to YouTube, was viewed 500,000 times. Late-night hosts, the arbiters of the nation's political zeitgeist, cemented the event in popular culture. Stephen Colbert, after playing the clip to a roaring studio audience, put his head in his hands in mock awe. Wow, he said, John Kennedy didn't just respond to a comment, he gave a spontaneous TED Talk on the lost art of human dignity. The story had escaped the gravity of the political news cycle and was now a cultural touchstone. On Instagram, artists turned Kennedy's words into elegant typography, overlaying, "You don't lead by making people feel small," on photographs of everyday heroes, firefighters, nurses, teachers, volunteers. A viral TikTok showed a group of kids of all races rebuilding a community playground. The audio a mashup of Kennedy's line about building each other up. It hit 8 million views in a single day. The moment was reshaping the national conversation, moving it, if only for a little while, away from the constant, grinding conflict and toward a reflection on character. The initial lightning strike in Phoenix had passed, but its light was now illuminating countless smaller conversations in homes, schools, and workplaces across the country, challenging people to consider not what their leaders said, but how they led, and that quiet revolution was only just beginning to grow. While the nation was swept up in a conversation about dignity and respect, the political machinery of Washington, D.C. processed the events in Phoenix through a different, colder calculus. In the corridors of power, a viral moment is not a lesson in civility, it is a weapon, a liability, an opportunity, or a crisis to be managed. As the sun rose over the Capitol the morning after the forum, the Phoenix moment was the only thing anyone was talking about, and the strategic battle to control its narrative had already begun. Inside the White House, the atmosphere was tense. Vice President Harris and her senior team were gathered in the Roosevelt Room. The mood a stark contrast to their usual disciplined focus. The viral clips played on a muted television in the corner, a constant, looping reminder of the unforced error. We have to hit back, and we have to hit back hard, her communications director argued, pacing the room. We frame Kennedy as a grandstanding cynic who exploited a moment for political gain. We change the subject. We talk about policy. We remind people of Kennedy's voting record. Tie him to the far right. We cannot let him own the narrative on respect. Another, more pragmatic advisor, her chief of staff, shook her head. It's too late for that. She countered, her voice low and grim. The narrative is already set. He didn't take the bait. He came across as the adult in the room. If we attack him now, we look petty. We prove his point for him. Harris herself was quiet, listening, her expression a mask of controlled frustration. She was a prosecutor by training, a fighter by instinct. Her comment had been a calculated jab, an attempt to assert dominance and put a folksy, often underestimated opponent on the back foot. She had expected a fumbling response, a flash of anger, anything but the serene, almost pitying calm with which Kennedy had absorbed the blow and turned it back on her. It was a rare and public miscalculation, and she knew it. I will not apologize, she finally said, her voice firm. I will not give him that. But we will not attack him personally, either. We pivot. We focus on the work. We talk about what we're doing for the American people. We act as if this is a minor distraction. We starve it of oxygen. It was a sound strategy, but one that underestimated the power of the moment she had created. The story was no longer a fire that could be starved, it was a wildfire. And it was already burning beyond their control. Across town, in a small, unassuming Senate office, the atmosphere was the polar opposite. The phones in Senator John Kennedy's office were ringing off the hook. The calls were not from angry constituents, but from news producers at every major network, from party strategists, and, most surprisingly, from a handful of moderate Democratic colleagues who, in quiet, off-the-record conversations, expressed a grudging admiration for how he had handled the situation. Kennedy's staff was ecstatic. His legislative director, a young, energetic woman, burst into his office with a tablet. Senator, our online fundraising has exploded. We've raised more in the last 12 hours than we did in the entire previous quarter. #StandWithKennedy is still trending. This is our moment. We need to book you on every morning show. A primetime special. This is a chance to define yourself on a national stage. Kennedy listened patiently, a small smile on his face. When she was finished, he shook his head gently. No, Sarah, no victory tour. His aide was incredulous. But, Senator, this is a once-in-a-career opportunity. You have the entire country's attention. And what do we want to do with that attention? Kennedy asked, his voice calm. Do we want to use it to spike a political football and attack the vice president? Or do we want to use it to actually talk about the things I said? About listening? About finding common ground? He leaned forward. We'll do 1 or 2 interviews. But the message is not, I won. The message is, we can do better. We keep the focus on the idea, not on the fight. If this moment is going to mean anything, it can't be about me. It has to be about us. It was a decision that frustrated the political instincts of his staff. But it was perfectly in character with the man who had won the stage in Phoenix not through aggression, but through restraint. On Capitol Hill, the rest of the political world was choosing sides. Republicans were gleeful, seeing a major crack in the administration's armor. They flooded the airwaves, not attacking Harris directly, but praising Kennedy's dignity and grace under pressure, using his words as a cudgel to paint the administration as arrogant and divisive. Democrats were in a far more difficult position. Publicly, they defended the vice president, dismissing the incident as a minor gaffe blown out of proportion. Privately, they were furious. In the senator's private dining room, 2 moderate Democrats spoke in hushed tones. She handed him the presidency on a silver platter. One lamented, all he has to do now is not screw it up. She made a folk hero out of John Kennedy. How do we even run against St. John of Phoenix now? The political battle lines were being drawn, not over a policy or a vote, but over a moment of pure political theater that had revealed a deep national yearning for a different kind of leadership. The White House had decided on a strategy of pivoting and ignoring. Kennedy had decided on a strategy of elevating the message over the man. But the story was now a living, breathing entity, and it was far from finished. The nation was watching to see what would happen next, and in the quiet halls of power, the next move was already being planned. In the days that followed the Phoenix Forum, the White House initiated its chosen strategy, to starve the fire of oxygen. The official schedule was a flurry of activity designed to project an image of a government hard at work, completely unconcerned with the previous week's trivialities. There were policy rollouts on infrastructure, roundtable discussions on the economy, and press releases celebrating job growth. The vice president was a whirlwind of motion, seen touring a semiconductor plant in Ohio and meeting with small business owners in Michigan. It was a classic, time-tested political pivot, an attempt to change the channel by sheer force of will. But the channel would not change. At the daily White House press briefing, the press secretary stood at the podium, armed with binders of economic data and policy points. After a brief opening statement, she pointed to a reporter in the front row. "Thank you," the journalist began, putting aside the latest jobs report. "The conversation that is dominating the country right now is about the tone of our political discourse." Stemming from the vice president's comments in Phoenix, does the White House believe Senator Kennedy's call for a new era of respect is something this administration supports? The press secretary's smile was tight, professional. The president and the vice president are focused every single day on delivering results for the American people. That's what they were elected to do, and that is where their focus remains. She pointed to another reporter. Does the vice president regret her choice of words toward Senator Kennedy? The vice president was making a forceful point during a spirited debate about the future of this country. The press secretary replied, sticking to the script, her focus is on the substantive issues that matter to families, not on a momentary exchange that the media has chosen to obsess over. But the questions kept coming. A relentless barrage. For 20 minutes, reporters from every major outlet ignored the policy announcements and hammered away at the same theme: respect, dignity, leadership, and the Phoenix moment. The administration's attempt to starve the fire was failing. The refusal to engage was looking less like disciplined strategy and more like an arrogant dismissal of a conversation the rest of the country was deeply invested in. Meanwhile, Senator Kennedy, adhering to his own strategy of restraint, agreed to a single, high-profile interview on a respected Sunday morning political show. He sat not in a television studio, but in his modest Washington office, a bookshelf lined with works of history and law behind him. The host, a seasoned journalist, got straight to the point. "Senator, you are at the center of a national firestorm. The Vice President of the United States publicly belittled you, and you are now being hailed by many as a symbol of a new kind of leadership. How do you respond to that?" Kennedy smiled, a warm, easy gesture. "Well, first, let's be clear, I'm no symbol. I'm just a guy from Louisiana who believes that we've gotten too used to yelling at each other and not used enough to listening to each other. What happened in Phoenix wasn't about me. And it wasn't about the vice president. It was a moment that revealed just how tired people are of the constant conflict." "But she called you, boy," the host pressed. "Many have called that a disrespectful, even a racist, comment. Do you believe she should apologize?" Kennedy shook his head, a firm but gentle refusal to take the bait. "I'm not going to get into labeling what she said. That's for other people to debate. My mother taught me that you can't control what other people say. You can only control how you respond. My focus isn't on apologies. It's on trying to live up to the words I said on that stage. It's on asking myself, and asking all of us, if we can do better, if we can treat each other with a little more grace." The interview was a masterstroke of his brand of quiet power. Every question about the conflict, he pivoted back to the message of unity. Every opportunity to attack, he gracefully declined. He came across not as a triumphant political victor, but as a thoughtful, sincere public servant, which only amplified the power of his original message. That message was now taking on a life of its own. In a high school in Ohio, a teacher created a lesson plan around the C-SPAN clip, asking her students to debate the meaning of leadership. In a Memphis church, a pastor delivered a sermon titled, "The Strength of Respect," which was shared thousands of times on Facebook. In Atlanta, a group of volunteers, inspired by Kennedy's call to lift each other up, organized a weekend-long neighborhood cleanup. Their custom-printed T-shirts bearing the hashtag #RespectUnites. Back in Washington, the pressure on the White House was becoming untenable. The failed press briefings, Kennedy's widely praised interview, and the organic, Grassroots spread of his message had made the administration's strategy of ignoring the issue look foolish and out of touch. In another tense meeting in the Roosevelt Room, the calculus had changed. Ignoring it isn't working, the chief of staff said, her voice grim. It's making us look like we're hiding. Like we don't have an answer. Kennedy is defining the entire national conversation. And we are silent. So, what do we do? The communications director asked. The earlier fight gone from his voice. We engage, the chief of staff replied. We reclaim the narrative. The vice president has to address this head on. Not the comment itself. The broader theme. She needs to own the conversation about unity and leadership. And frame it on our terms. The decision was made. A new strategy was born not out of confidence, but out of necessity. That evening, the White House press office sent out an advisory to all major news networks. It was a single, momentous sentence. Tomorrow evening at 8 p.m., the Vice President of the United States will deliver a primetime address to the nation from the Oval Office on the topic of unity and the future of American discourse. The stage was set for a new confrontation. This time, however, it would not be a spontaneous exchange. It would be a carefully planned, high-stakes address to the entire nation. The fire that had been lit in Phoenix was about to either be extinguished or fanned into an even greater inferno. The announcement of the vice president's primetime address sent a jolt through the political world. The 24-hour news cycle, which had been feasting on the Phoenix moment, went into overdrive. Speculation was rampant. Would she apologize? Would she double down? Would she attack Kennedy, reframing him as a disingenuous actor? The speech was no longer just a response, it was a high-stakes gamble. An attempt by the White House to seize control of a narrative that had spiraled far beyond them. On the evening of the address, a palpable sense of anticipation settled over the nation. In bars and living rooms, people who rarely paid attention to political speeches were tuning in. The moment had transcended politics and become a national drama. In his quiet Washington apartment, Senator John Kennedy sat not in a war room with aides, but alone in an armchair, reading a history book. His chief of staff called, the anxiety in his voice evident even through the phone. Senator, the world is waiting to see how you'll react to her speech. We've got drafts of 3 different press statements ready to go, depending on what she says. Kennedy chuckled, a low, warm sound. Michael, put the drafts away. Let's just listen to what the vice president has to say. I hope she talks about what unites us. That's what this should be about. He was deliberately, pointedly, refusing to play the game of political combat. A decision that both frustrated and awed his staff. At exactly 8 p.m., the image on the nation's television screens switched to the solemn, august setting of the Oval Office. Vice President Harris sat behind the resolute desk, her posture poised, her expression serious and composed. The speech began not with a defense or an attack, but with a surprising act of appropriation. My fellow Americans, she started, her voice measured and presidential. In recent days, our nation has been engaged in a powerful and necessary conversation. A conversation about the nature of our discourse, about the tone of our politics, and about the respect we owe one another as citizens of this great republic. She did not mention Phoenix. She did not mention Kennedy. She didn't have to. I have listened to that conversation, she continued, looking directly into the camera, and I believe it is a healthy one. It is clear that the American people are tired of the constant conflict. They are tired of the shouting, of the personal attacks, of a political culture that too often seeks to divide us rather than unite us. And they are right. It was a politically brilliant maneuver. She was not apologizing for her words. She was positioning herself as the leader who had listened to the national dialogue her words had sparked, and was now ready to guide it forward. Strong leaders can have passionate disagreements, she stated, subtly reframing the incident. Our democracy depends on spirited debate. But that debate must be rooted in a fundamental respect for one another, and for the institutions we serve. When our discourse strays into simple personal attacks, we fail to live up to our highest ideals. She then pivoted, seamlessly weaving the theme of unity into the administration's core agenda. But true unity is not just about the words we say. It is about the actions we take. True unity is a father in Ohio going to work at a newly rebuilt factory thanks to our infrastructure plan. True unity is a mother in Arizona knowing her children can drink clean water. This administration believes that the ultimate act of respect for the American people is to deliver results that improve their lives. For 15 minutes, she spoke eloquently about policy, about jobs, about the economy, all under the grand, unifying theme of respect and action. It was a masterfully crafted speech, designed to neutralize Kennedy's message by absorbing it, to turn his quiet call for dignity into a loud declaration of her own administration's values. The immediate reaction was, predictably, split down the middle. On CNN, a panel of commentators praised the address. A deeply presidential moment, one analyst declared. She heard the country, she acknowledged the need for a better tone, and she skillfully pivoted back to the work her administration is doing. She took ownership of the conversation. On Fox News, the take was far more cynical. That was the most eloquent non-apology apology in modern political history. A host argued, she didn't apologize to Senator Kennedy, she stole his speech. She tried to take credit for a conversation that she only started because she publicly insulted him. On social media, the divide was just as stark. Her supporters flooded Twitter with praise. That's my vice president, leading with strength and grace. #leadership is action. But Kennedy's newfound supporters were not convinced. Notice what she didn't say. I'm sorry. #actions, not just words. The administration had made its move. They had not bowed, but they had bent, attempting to reshape the narrative in their own image. The ball was now back in John Kennedy's court. In his apartment, the senator watched the end of the speech. His expression unreadable. His phone began to buzz. His chief of staff on the line again. Senator, the morning shows are all calling. They want your reaction. GMA. Today. All of them. What do we say? She just tried to co-opt our entire message. Kennedy looked at the screen, where pundits were already fiercely debating the speech's merits. He was silent for a long moment. She used a lot of good words. He finally said, his voice quiet and thoughtful. Now we'll just have to see if the actions match. The morning after the vice president's address, the political world held its breath, waiting for Senator Kennedy's rebuttal. The stage was set for a classic Washington showdown. Harris had delivered a polished, strategic speech. The natural next move was for Kennedy to appear on the morning shows, dissect her words, and call out the non-apology apology. His staff, sensing a moment to press their advantage, had a full media schedule prepared. But when the sun rose, Kennedy's office released a brief, two-sentence statement that completely upended all expectations. The vice president spoke about the importance of action. I agree. That's why I will be spending the next week listening to the American people, not talking on television. The move was strategically brilliant and utterly confounding to the political establishment. Kennedy was refusing to play the game. Instead of engaging in a war of words with the White House, he was quietly changing the definition of the battlefield. The national conversation, he had decided, would not be won by the person who talked the loudest, but by the person who listened the hardest. While Washington pundits debated his unconventional tactic, Kennedy was on a plane. His first stop was not a major media market, but a small, unassuming diner in a working-class neighborhood of Pittsburgh. It was the same diner where, just a week earlier, a group of factory workers had gathered around a television to watch the clip from Phoenix. There were no press releases, no banners, no stump speeches. Kennedy simply walked in, ordered a cup of coffee, and sat down at a booth with the same group of men. For the next hour, he didn't talk about Washington or the vice president. He asked about their shifts, their families, the rising cost of groceries, and their concerns about the future of the local steel industry. He listened, nodding, taking notes in a small, worn notebook. A single local news reporter, tipped off by a diner employee, captured the scene. The images that emerged were not of a powerful senator, but of a man sharing coffee, his brow furrowed in concentration as a steelworker explained the intricacies of his job. The story, posted on the local station's website, was simple. After Phoenix, Senator Kennedy comes to Pittsburgh to listen. By noon, The story and its accompanying photos had been shared hundreds of thousands of times. His next stop was the high school in Miami, where the teacher had used the clip as a lesson plan. He didn't address the student body in a grand assembly. Instead, he sat in a desk in her history class. A 6 feet 1 inch senator crammed into a chair designed for a teenager, and participated in their discussion. He asked the students what leadership meant to them. He listened to their ideas about how to bridge divides in their own communities. The image of Kennedy raising his hand to be called on by a high school junior went viral almost instantly. The contrast with the vice president's solemn, teleprompter-driven address from the Oval Office could not have been more stark. Harris had spoken about unity from the highest seat of power. Kennedy was demonstrating it, person by person, in the most humble of settings. The narrative began to shift. Online, the conversation moved from debating the vice president's speech to celebrating Kennedy's listening tour. The hashtag actions not words began to trend. A direct, if unspoken, critique of the White House's rhetorical strategy. People started posting their own stories, inviting Kennedy to their towns, their community centers, their churches. Back in Washington, the vice president's team was at a loss. Their speech, designed to be the final word on the matter, had been rendered a mere prologue. They couldn't attack Kennedy for meeting with steelworkers and high school students. They couldn't criticize him for listening. They were forced to watch, in silent frustration, as he continued to dominate the national conversation without ever appearing on a major news network. He was winning the war by refusing to fight. The week continued in the same vein. He met with the pastor in Houston, not to speak from the pulpit, but to sit in the pews and talk with the congregation after the service. He visited the community center in Denver and listened to teenagers present their ideas for a local park. The tour culminated in a moment of quiet, powerful symbolism. Kennedy returned to Phoenix, not for a media event, but to meet privately with a group of local community leaders, including the pastor and the community organizer who had been in the audience at the forum. They met not in a convention center, but in a small church basement. "You started a conversation that our country desperately needs to have," the pastor told him. "How do we keep it going?" Kennedy looked at the faces around the table. "By doing this," he said simply, "by talking to each other, by listening. It doesn't start in Washington. It starts here." The listening tour had successfully reframed the entire event. It was no longer about a gaffe and a rebuttal. It was about a fundamental contrast in leadership styles. Top-down versus bottom-up, speaking versus listening, performance versus presence. The final, game-changing move came the following week. A prominent, well-respected Republican governor, a man often seen as a potential future leader of his party, publicly released a letter. Senator Kennedy, it read, "Your actions over the past week have demonstrated a commitment to bipartisan dialogue that our country sorely needs. The challenges we face are not Democratic or Republican, they are American. In that spirit, I would like to formally invite you to my state to hold a joint town hall, to listen to the concerns of my constituents, and to show the nation that unity is not just a word in a speech, but a practice we can live out." The invitation was a political bombshell. It was the first tangible, bipartisan outcome of the Phoenix moment. Kennedy had not just sparked a conversation, he had created an opportunity for real, cross-aisle collaboration, putting the principles he spoke of into concrete action. The nation, and the White House, now watched to see what he would do next. Of course, here is the eighth and final part of the narrative, which explores the lasting impact of the events and includes the requested analytical conclusion. Part 8. The Precedent. The joint town hall was held not in a grand auditorium, but in a high school gymnasium in a politically purple suburb of the governor's state. The air was filled with the faint scent of waxed floors and the quiet murmur of a genuinely curious and slightly skeptical crowd. There were no partisan signs, no coordinated chants. The stage was simple: 2 chairs, a small table, and a shared microphone. The event was unlike anything modern politics had seen. Senator John Kennedy, a Democrat from Louisiana, and the popular Republican governor did not debate. They co-moderated. They took turns reading questions submitted by the audience on index cards. Questions about everything from the price of healthcare to the state of local infrastructure and the role of America in the world. When they disagreed on policy, they did so respectfully, explaining their positions without resorting to attacks. More often than not, they found themselves searching for, and occasionally finding, threads of common ground. The most powerful moments came when they turned to each other and simply listened. "Governor, I'm not sure I agree with your conclusion on that," Kennedy said at one point, after a discussion on trade policy. "But I understand the principle you're coming from. Help me understand why you believe that's the best path for the workers in your state." The exchange, and others like it, was revolutionary in its civility. The image of two leaders from opposing parties, engaged in a genuine, respectful dialogue, was broadcast across the nation. It was the living embodiment of the message Kennedy had first articulated in Phoenix. This single, successful bipartisan event became a template. In the months that followed, the Phoenix effect began to ripple through the country's political landscape. Other politicians, sensing the deep public hunger for a less toxic form of debate, began to cautiously reach across the aisle. A group of freshman representatives, both Democrats and Republicans, formed an informal civility caucus to find common ground on local issues. The phrases, "respect unites," and "lift them up," started to appear in city council meetings and school board debates, used by ordinary citizens to call for a higher standard of discourse. For Vice President Harris, the fallout was permanent. Her politically savvy primetime address had been a temporary bomb, but it had not healed the self-inflicted wound. The "sit down, boy" moment became an indelible part of her public image, a political scar that her opponents would use as a shorthand for perceived arrogance. She had not been destroyed, but she had been diminished, her attempt to project strength having been masterfully reframed as a moment of weakness. For John Kennedy, the transformation was profound. He was no longer just a folksy, often underestimated senator from Louisiana. He was now a national figure, an accidental leader of a movement for civic decency that he had never intended to start. His office was flooded with mail. Grassroots donations continued to pour in. Polls showed him with staggering approval ratings that crossed party lines. Yet, he resisted all calls to capitalize on his newfound fame. He turned down a multi-million-dollar book deal. He politely declined invitations to headline major party fundraisers. He continued his quiet work in the Senate, focusing on the unglamorous but necessary tasks of legislation. He had been given a national platform, but he refused to use it as a pedestal for personal ambition. His power, it seemed, was rooted in his very reluctance to seek it. The narrative concluded months later. With Kennedy back in his quiet office, an aide entered, holding a tablet with the latest national poll. "Senator," the aide said, unable to contain his excitement, "you're now the most respected political figure in the country. People are already talking about 2028. Kennedy looked up from a thick report on agricultural subsidies. He smiled that same, small, measured smile. "That's nice, Michael," he said, his Louisiana drawl as warm as ever. "But have you seen the latest projections on soybean yields? We've got a real problem brewing for our farmers down on the Delta." He had returned to the work, to the people he served, leaving the future of the movement he had inadvertently sparked as an open and hopeful question for the nation to answer. The confrontation between Vice President Harris and Senator Kennedy, and its subsequent national resonance, serves as a powerful case study in the dynamics of modern political communication and the deep-seated public hunger for authenticity. The event's lasting impact can be understood by analyzing three key themes: the asymmetric power of restraint, the viral nature of character, and the public's rejection of performative dominance. First and foremost, the Phoenix moment was a masterclass in the power of restraint. In an era where political discourse is often defined by who can shout the loudest or deliver the sharpest insult, Kennedy's primary weapon was his silence. His deliberate, 10-second pause after Harris' comment was not an act of passivity but a profound act of strategic control. It allowed her words to hang in the air, stripped of their intended power, and expose themselves as needlessly aggressive. This silence created a vacuum that the audience filled with their own discomfort and judgment. His subsequent response was not a counterattack but a reframing, elevating the conversation from a personal spat to a discussion on the nature of respect itself. This demonstrated that in a political landscape saturated with noise, quiet dignity can be the most powerful and disruptive force. Secondly, the event highlights the viral nature of character. In the 21st century media ecosystem, a political career can be defined less by years of policy work and more by a single, unscripted moment that reveals perceived character. Harris' comment, intended to project strength and authority, was widely interpreted as condescending and arrogant. Kennedy's response, rooted in humility and grace, was seen as a reflection of authentic character. The public's overwhelming reaction was not a judgment on their respective policy positions, but on the human qualities they displayed in a moment of high pressure. The story spread so rapidly and resonated so deeply because it was fundamentally a human story, not a political one, and it tapped into a national exhaustion with performative, divisive leadership. Finally, the saga represents a powerful rejection of a specific model of leadership. The vice president's approach was a classic example of a top-down, dominance-based leadership style, one that relies on title, position, and the assertion of authority to command respect. Kennedy, in response, offered a bottom-up, service-based model, arguing that respect is not demanded but earned through action, listening, and a demonstrated commitment to unity. The public's embrace of Kennedy's message was not just an endorsement of one politician over another, it was an endorsement of an entirely different philosophy of power. The failure of the White House's subsequent, highly polished rhetorical strategy, compared to the success of Kennedy's humble, listening tour, proved the point. The public was no longer interested in being spoken to, they were desperate to be listened to. Ultimately, the Phoenix moment did not heal the nation's deep political divisions, but it did serve as a powerful cultural corrective. It provided a new language and a new precedent for demanding a higher standard of public discourse. It was a rare and potent reminder that true strength in leadership is often found not in the force of an attack, but in the quiet, unshakable grace of one's response.